My mother said 7 words to me that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Don't come home this year. Your sister doesn't want you there. Just like that. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I was no longer welcome in my own family's house. My plane ticket was already booked. My suitcase was sitting by the door. The gifts I bought for everyone were wrapped and ready. And in less than 10 seconds, something inside me finally understood a truth I had been avoiding for years. I wasn't just being uninvited from dinner. I was being erased. So that Thanksgiving, while my parents and my sister were sitting around the table, posting smiling photos online, I was eating turkey alone in a small restaurant in Boston, trying not to cry in front of strangers. But what happened next was something none of us could have predicted. Because the strangers sitting at the table beside me that night would eventually become the people I call Mom and Dad. And 5 years later, on the happiest day of my life, my biological parents walked into my wedding uninvited, just in time to hear the announcer say something that turned my mother's face completely white. Please welcome the parents of the bride. But it wasn't them. Before I tell you how a lonely Thanksgiving dinner led to that moment, take a second to subscribe to the channel. That way, if life gets busy and you can't finish this story today, you'll be able to come back and find it again, along with many other powerful stories about family betrayal and the unexpected ways life can change. And I want to ask you something. If your own family told you not to come home for the holidays, would you keep trying to earn your place at their table? Or would you finally walk away and build a life without them? Because the night my family shut the door on me was the night another family quietly opened theirs. What none of us realized at the time was that one small invitation would eventually lead to a wedding day, a confrontation, and a truth my parents were never prepared to face. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old now, but the story I'm about to tell you didn't really begin with that phone call before Thanksgiving. It started many years earlier, inside a house where everyone had a role to play. In my family, there were always 2 very different roles. My older sister Natalie was the golden child, and somehow, without anyone ever officially saying it out loud, I became the problem. Natalie was 3 years older than me. She had a personality that seemed to fill every room she walked into. She was confident, outgoing, and naturally charming in a way that made people instantly like her. Teachers adored her, neighbors praised her, and my parents, well, they treated her like the center of the universe. When Natalie needed something, the entire household shifted around her. When I needed something, I usually learned to wait, or eventually, to stop asking. I remember the moment I first understood how things worked in our family. I was 16 years old. For weeks, I had been planning a small birthday party at a bowling alley with a few friends from school. Nothing fancy, just pizza laughter and maybe a chocolate cake from the bakery I loved. My mom had already picked up the cake that morning. I remember seeing it in the kitchen, sitting on the counter with my name written in pink frosting. But around noon that day, everything changed. Natalie called the house from college. She had just failed a calculus exam, and she was crying. Within minutes, the entire house shifted into emergency mode. My mom spent hours on the phone comforting her. My dad got into the car and drove across town to bring her lunch and talk things through. By late afternoon, my birthday party had quietly disappeared. "Emma, don't be dramatic," she said gently. "Your sister really needs us today. We'll celebrate next weekend." But next weekend never came. And strangely, I didn't even argue. At the time, I told myself something that would later become a habit. Families have emergencies. Things happen. It's not a big deal. But moments like that kept repeating themselves. When I graduated from college, I had worked harder than anyone in my family even realized. I paid for most of my tuition by working late shifts at a small cafe near campus. Many nights I studied until 2 in the morning just to keep my grades high. When I finally graduated with honors, that ceremony meant everything to me. But when I walked across the stage and looked out at the audience, the 2 seats reserved for my parents were empty. They arrived almost 2 hours later. Natalie had a prenatal doctor appointment that morning, and apparently it couldn't be rescheduled. My mom hugged me afterward and said the words I would never forget. "Sweetheart, you understand, right? Natalie's pregnancy is more important than a ceremony. More important than my ceremony. More important than me." The strange thing is, I stopped fighting after a while. Anytime I tried to explain how I felt, the response was always the same. "Emma, you're too sensitive. Why do you always make everything about yourself? Your sister simply has more going on in her life right now." Eventually, I learned something very important. If I stayed quiet, things were easier. So I became the easy daughter, the quiet one, the one who apologized first, even when I didn't know what I had done wrong. Over time, I began shrinking parts of myself without even realizing it. Smaller expectations, smaller voice, smaller presence in the family. I convinced myself that patience was the answer. If I was kind enough, understanding enough, agreeable enough, maybe someday my parents would look at me the same way they looked at Natalie. Maybe one day they would finally choose me too. But the truth is, when you spend your entire life trying to make yourself easier to love, something very dangerous can happen. People get used to you disappearing. And by the time I was 27 years old, I had spent so many years being the easy daughter that my family had learned something about me. They had learned that I was the one person who could always be sacrificed, which is exactly why, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother had no trouble picking up the phone and telling me not to come home. At the time, I thought that phone call was the most painful moment of my life. What I didn't realize yet was that it was also the beginning of something none of us could have predicted. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my suitcase was already packed. It sat quietly beside the front door of my small apartment in Boston, like it had been waiting patiently for the trip home. I had bought the plane ticket weeks earlier. Inside the suitcase were small wrapped gifts for everyone. A sweater for my dad, a cookbook my mom had once mentioned wanting, and a toy train set for my sister's little boy. Nothing expensive, just small things that said I was thinking about you. Because no matter how complicated things had always been in my family, a part of me still believed the holidays were different. Thanksgiving was supposed to be the one day when everyone put aside old frustrations. One day when families came back together. But that illusion ended with a single phone call. After my mother told me not to come home, I stood there for a long time staring at the suitcase. The room felt strangely quiet. Part of me thought maybe my father would call back and fix everything. So I called him. When he answered, I could hear a football game playing loudly on the television behind him. "Hey, kiddo," he said casually. "Dad," I asked carefully, "did Mom tell you what she said?" There was a pause. "I heard about it," he replied. My heart started beating faster. "So, you're okay with this?" I asked. "You think it's normal that I'm not allowed to come home for Thanksgiving?" Another pause. "You know how your mother is," he said quietly. "She's just trying to keep the peace by excluding me." "It's not like that," he said. "Then what is it like?" I asked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I swallowed and asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for years. "Dad, do you want me there?" 5 seconds passed, then 10. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I think maybe it's better if you listen to your mother this year." Something inside me went very still. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Okay." Then I hung up the phone. That was the moment I understood something I had been avoiding for most of my life. I wasn't just the daughter who caused tension in the family. I was the one who could be removed whenever things became inconvenient. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and quiet. When I woke up, the apartment felt unusually still. Through the ceiling, I could hear muffled footsteps and children running around in the apartment above mine. Someone's family had arrived early. Laughter drifted through the floorboards. For a few minutes, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. My phone sat on the bedside table, silent. No messages. No happy Thanksgiving. Not even a short text. Around noon, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Snow had begun falling lightly across the street. Across the road, I watched a family helping an elderly woman into the back seat of a car. They were laughing about something. It looked warm, normal, safe, the kind of moment people take for granted. Until it's gone. Out of habit, I opened Instagram. The first photo in my feed was posted by my sister Natalie. It showed my parents, Natalie, her husband, and their toddler sitting around a Thanksgiving table. Everyone was smiling. The caption read, "So grateful for my beautiful family this year." I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Then something else caught my eye. There were 5 chairs at the table, 4 adults, 1 child, no empty seat. They hadn't just asked me not to come home. They had already replaced me. I slowly locked my phone and set it down. For a moment, I considered doing what most people probably would have done. Ordering takeout, turning on the television, pretending it was just another Thursday. But something inside me resisted that idea. If I was going to spend Thanksgiving alone, I didn't want to do it sitting in the dark. So I put on my coat and walked outside into the cold afternoon. The streets were quiet. Most of the restaurants were closed. But after wandering for a while, I found one place still open. A small, old-fashioned restaurant called Riverside Grill. Warm, yellow light glowed through the windows. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and fresh bread filled the air. Nearly every table was full of families enjoying their holiday meal. The hostess greeted me with a gentle smile. "Just one?" she asked. I nodded. She led me to a small table near the corner, right beside a large group that had pushed several tables together. 3 generations sat there. Grandparents, parents, children, everyone talking and laughing at the same time. My plate arrived a few minutes later. Turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing. Everything looked perfect, but I barely touched it. The laughter at the table beside me kept pulling my attention. At one point, the youngest boy told a joke so terrible that the entire table groaned in unison. And somehow, that was the moment the tears came. Quietly at first. I turned toward the window and wiped my eyes with a napkin, hoping no one would notice. But someone did. A gentle voice beside me said softly, "Honey, are you all right?" I looked up quickly when I heard the woman's voice. She was standing beside my table, holding a small coffee cup in her hands. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes had the kind of warmth that makes you feel seen, even before a single word is spoken. "Honey, are you all right?" she asked, again gently. I wiped my face quickly and forced a small smile. "I'm fine," I said. "Just allergies." She raised one eyebrow slightly. "Well," she said kindly, "allergies usually don't make people cry on Thanksgiving." Despite everything, I let out a small laugh. I guess it had been obvious. She glanced back toward the large table beside me, where the rest of her family was still laughing and talking. Then she looked back at me. "My name is Margaret," she said softly, "and no one should spend Thanksgiving alone." Immediately, I shook my head. "Oh no, I couldn't," I said quickly. "I don't want to interrupt your family dinner." "You wouldn't be interrupting," she replied calmly. "You'd be joining." Behind her, a tall man with gray hair lifted his glass and smiled toward me. "That's my wife inviting you," he called out warmly. "And trust me, she rarely asks twice." A younger man sitting across from him chuckled. "It's true," he said. "Resistance is usually pointless." I looked down at my untouched plate for a moment. Then I glanced back at their table. Chairs were already being moved slightly, making space. Margaret gently placed a hand on the back of my chair. "Come sit with us," she said. "There's always room for one more." For a moment I hesitated. Every instinct in me said this was strange. You don't normally join a stranger's family dinner. But something about Margaret's voice felt sincere, uncomplicated, safe. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood up. And that small decision, walking the few steps from my lonely table to theirs, changed my life in ways I could never have imagined. The moment I sat down, something surprising happened. No one treated me like an outsider. There were no awkward questions, no polite smiles that quietly say you don't belong. Instead, someone immediately handed me a warm dinner roll. Another person poured a glass of wine. The gray-haired man leaned forward and offered his hand. "Well now," he said warmly, "since you're officially part of this chaos, we should probably introduce ourselves. I'm Thomas Hayes." He gestured toward Margaret beside him. "And this wonderful troublemaker is my wife, Margaret." Margaret laughed softly. Thomas then began pointing around the table. "Our oldest son, Daniel, his wife, Rachel, their 2 kids, and over there is our youngest son, Luke." Luke lifted his glass slightly and smiled. "Nice to meet you," he said. "And you must be Emma." I blinked in surprise. "How did you know my name?" I asked. Margaret smiled. "You look like someone who needed a seat at the table," she said. That was enough. For the next 2 hours, something I hadn't expected began to happen. I relaxed. The conversation moved easily around the table. Daniel talked about his work. Rachel shared a story about her daughter accidentally bringing a frog into school. Thomas attempted 3 terrible turkey jokes in a row, each one worse than the last. And somehow, everyone still laughed. At one point, I caught myself laughing too. Not the polite laugh I used with coworkers. A real laugh. The kind that rises from somewhere deep inside. For a moment, I forgot that I had walked into that restaurant feeling completely alone. Later that evening, after most of the plates had been cleared and pumpkin pie had been served, Margaret quietly moved her chair closer to mine. She lowered her voice slightly. "Are you feeling a little better now?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, actually I am." She studied my face, the way someone does when they genuinely want to understand. Then she asked gently, "Do you want to tell me what happened earlier?" For a moment, I considered brushing it off. But something about Margaret made pretending feel unnecessary. So I told her about the phone call, about my sister, about the empty chair that never existed at my family's table. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You know," she said quietly, "I spent 30 years working as a family counselor." I looked up in surprise. "I've met many families who appear perfect from the outside," she continued. "But behind closed doors, someone is always carrying the blame for everything." Her voice softened. "And very often, it's the quiet one, the one who tries the hardest, the one who keeps asking for fairness." She rested her hand gently on mine. "Emma," she said kindly, "you are not the problem." Those words hit me harder than anything else she could have said. Because in my entire life, no one had ever said them to me before. Before we left the restaurant that night, Margaret handed me a small card. Her address was written neatly on the back. "Sunday dinners," she said with a warm smile. "Every week. You're welcome anytime." I thanked her, politely, but I wasn't sure I would go. It felt too generous, too unexpected. But what I didn't realize yet was that the Hayes family had already made room for me. And once someone truly sees you, it becomes very difficult to go back to being invisible. I didn't go to the Hayes family dinner the following Sunday, or the Sunday after that. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about it felt too generous, too unexpected. People didn't usually invite strangers into their lives like that. At least, not in my experience. For weeks, I kept Margaret's card sitting on my kitchen counter. Sometimes I picked it up. Sometimes I turned it over in my hands. But every time Sunday came around, I told myself the same thing. It would be awkward. I would be intruding. Eventually, they would realize they had only invited me out of kindness and regret it. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks later, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, I heard Margaret's warm voice on the other end. "Emma, dear, I just wanted to check on you." She didn't ask why I hadn't come. She didn't make me feel guilty. She simply asked how I was doing. That simple kindness was what finally convinced me. The following Sunday, I drove to the address on the card. When I arrived, I sat in my car for nearly 5 minutes before getting out. The house looked exactly the way you would imagine a welcoming home to look. Warm lights glowing in the windows, laughter drifting through the front door, For a moment, I almost drove away. Then the door suddenly opened. Margaret stepped outside with a wide smile, as if she had been expecting me all along. "There you are," she said, pulling me into a hug like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. And just like that, Sunday dinners quietly became part of my life. Weeks turned into months. Months slowly turned into years. Thomas began teaching me how to play chess at the kitchen table, even though I lost almost every game. Margaret showed me family recipes she had collected for decades. Daniel's kids started calling me Aunt Emma, even though no one had ever told them to. Somehow, I had become part of their routine, part of their table, part of their family. And then there was Luke. Luke had a quiet kind of humor that made conversations feel effortless. After Sunday dinners, we often stayed outside on the back porch, talking long after everyone else had gone inside. Sometimes about books, sometimes about dreams, sometimes about the strange ways life can take unexpected turns. One evening, nearly 2 years after that first Thanksgiving, Luke asked if I wanted to meet him for dinner. When I arrived at the restaurant, I immediately recognized it. Riverside Grill, the same place where we had first met. Luke smiled when he saw my expression. "I thought it might be nice to come back here," he said, "to the place where everything started." For a moment, we simply sat there, remembering that strange Thanksgiving night. Then Luke reached across the table and gently took my hand. "Emma," he said quietly, "I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you." Before I could fully process what he meant, he pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. And just like that, Luke Hayes asked me to marry him. For the first time in my life, love didn't feel like something I had to earn. I was simply being chosen. Wedding planning turned out to be both exciting and overwhelming. There were flowers to choose, venues to visit, music, menus, guest lists, dozens of small decisions that somehow turned into hundreds. But for me, one small detail felt heavier than all the others. It was a single line printed near the top of every formal wedding invitation. Parents of the bride. One evening, I sat at the Hayes kitchen table, staring at the blank space on a sample invitation. Luke was across the room measuring decorations. Margaret was flipping through flower arrangements, but my eyes kept returning to that empty line. For a moment, I thought about writing my biological parents' names, George and Linda Carter. But the idea made my chest tighten. They hadn't called me in nearly 3 years. Not on my birthday, not on Christmas, not once. And yet tradition said their names belonged there. Margaret must have noticed my expression. She quietly sat beside me. "What's troubling you, sweetheart?" she asked. I showed her the invitation. "I don't know what to write here," I admitted. Margaret studied the blank line for a moment. Then she said something that completely caught me off guard. "You know, there is another option." I looked up. "What do you mean?" Margaret folded her hands calmly. "There's a legal process called adult adoption." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. "Adult adoption," I repeated. She nodded gently. "It allows someone to formally become part of a family, even as an adult. New legal records, new next of kin status, everything." My heart began beating faster. "That's actually possible." Margaret smiled softly. "Very possible." I glanced across the room at Thomas and Luke, talking near the window. These people had welcomed me into their lives without hesitation. They had fed me, listened to me, loved me, but the idea still felt enormous. "Would you and Thomas ever consider something like that?" I asked carefully. Before I could finish the sentence, Margaret wrapped her arms around me. "We considered you our daughter the day you sat down at that restaurant table," she whispered. "We were simply waiting for you to be ready." The adoption process took several months. There were legal documents to file, interviews to attend, signatures to complete. But strangely, none of it felt complicated. In many ways, it simply felt like paperwork, catching up with something that had already happened in our hearts. The day the judge finalized everything, Margaret cried openly in the courtroom. Thomas cleared his throat several times and pretended he had something in his eye. And just like that, Emma Carter officially became Emma Hayes. For the first time in my life, something settled quietly inside me. Not excitement, not relief, something deeper, belonging. A few weeks later, the wedding invitations were finally ready to be sent out. And the blank line that had once troubled me so much was no longer empty. It now read, "Parents of the bride, Thomas and Margaret Hayes." I knew there was a chance my biological family would eventually find out, but I didn't expect it to happen so quickly. About 3 months before the wedding, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I hadn't seen in years. "Natalie." The message was short. "I heard you're getting married." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I quietly blocked the number. A few days later, my phone rang 5 times in one afternoon. My mother. I didn't answer. Eventually, a text appeared. "Why didn't you tell us about your wedding? We're your family. Call me immediately." I read the message once, then deleted it. 3 years of silence, and suddenly, they remembered I existed. I assumed that would be the end of it. But one Tuesday afternoon, while I was working from home, reviewing design proofs on my laptop, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my mother was standing in the hallway. She looked older than I remembered, but the expression on her face was exactly the same. Disapproval. She stepped inside before I even invited her. "Emma," she said sharply, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" I closed the door slowly. "What do you mean?" "Getting married without telling your own parents," she snapped. I folded my arms calmly. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. That was one Thanksgiving," she said dismissively. "You're still upset about that." A strange calm settled over me. "I'm not upset anymore," I replied quietly. I moved on. Her eyes began scanning the apartment. They stopped on the framed photographs sitting on the bookshelf. Pictures of me and Luke. Pictures of Christmas dinners. Pictures of Sunday afternoons with the Hayes family. Her voice tightened. "Who are these people?" I met her gaze. "My family." Her face twisted in disbelief. "I am your family," she said. "You were," I replied softly. Then I opened the front door. "And you're not invited to the wedding." She stood there frozen in the hallway. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. But as I closed the door, one thought crossed my mind. I had a feeling that wasn't the last time I would see her before the wedding day. The morning of the wedding arrived warm and bright. The ceremony was held at a vineyard just outside Napa Valley. Rows of green vines stretched across the hills, glowing under the afternoon sun. Inside the bridal suite, Margaret stood behind me, adjusting my veil. "You look beautiful," she said softly. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back looked calm, steady, very different from the girl who once sat alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving, wondering why her own family didn't seem to want her. On the table beside the mirror lay the wedding program. I picked it up and read the line I had once struggled with. "Parents of the bride, Thomas and Margaret Hayes." Margaret noticed where I was looking. She gently placed her hands on my shoulders. "No matter what happens today," she said quietly, "remember this. You are loved." I turned and hugged her tightly. "I know," I whispered. Outside, guests were beginning to arrive. The ceremony started soon after. Thomas walked me down the aisle with quiet pride. Luke's smile grew wider with every step I took toward him. When the officiant finally said the words, "You may kiss the bride," the entire crowd erupted into applause. For a moment, everything felt perfect, but the moment that would change everything came during the reception. Music played softly, while guests laughed and talked over dinner. Suddenly, a member of the security team approached our table. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "there are 2 people at the entrance claiming to be your parents." My stomach tightened slightly. Luke leaned closer. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked. I shook my head. "No," I said calmly. "I'll handle it." After thinking for a moment, I gave the guard a simple instruction. "Let them in, but seat them in the back." A few minutes later, I saw them. My mother and father stood near the entrance of the reception hall, looking uncertain as they scanned the room full of guests, celebrating a wedding they had never been invited to. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly into the microphone, "before we continue the celebration, we'd like to introduce 2 very special people." Across the room, my mother straightened her posture slightly. I could almost see her preparing herself to stand, preparing to accept the recognition she believed belonged to her. The MC smiled. Please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride. A brief pause filled the room. Then he continued, Thomas and Margaret Hayes. The entire hall erupted into applause. Thomas and Margaret stood from their seats at the head table, smiling as the guests cheered. Across the room, my mother's face slowly turned pale. She grabbed my father's arm. What did he just say? She whispered. My father didn't answer, because both of them were now staring at the same thing. Margaret hugging me proudly, Thomas raising a glass toward the crowd. To everyone else in that room, it made perfect sense. Of course they were my parents. But my biological parents knew the truth. My mother pushed her way through the crowd until she reached me. Her voice was sharp and furious. What is going on? I met her eyes calmly. My legal parents, I said simply. I was adopted 2 years ago. Her mouth fell open. You can't just replace us. I shook my head slowly. I didn't replace you, I said quietly. You left first. Guests nearby had begun to notice the tension. My father stepped forward slowly. For the first time in my life, he looked ashamed. Emma, he said quietly, I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you years ago. His words hung in the air between us, but they came too late. I believe you're sorry, I said gently. But sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent trying to earn your love. Margaret stepped beside me. My mother glared at her. You stole our daughter, she snapped. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm enough to silence the room. No, ma'am, he said. We didn't steal anything. He looked directly at her. You gave her away. If you step back and look at Emma's story from a wider perspective, something very important is happening beneath the surface. For most of her life, Emma believed the problem was her. She believed she was too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult to love. And sadly, that belief is extremely common in families like hers. As someone who has spent many years studying family dynamics, I can tell you that many households quietly assign invisible roles to their children. There is often a golden child, the one who receives protection, praise, and endless second chances. And then there is the scapegoat, the one who absorbs the tension, the one blamed for the discomfort others don't want to face. Very often the scapegoat is the child who asks difficult questions, the child who notices unfairness, the child who quietly refuses to pretend everything is perfect. But here is the truth many people never realize. The scapegoat is rarely the real problem. In many cases, they are simply the first person brave enough to stop playing a role that was never fair to begin with. Emma's story is not really about revenge. It is about something much more powerful: boundaries. When Emma finally stopped begging for a seat at a table where she was never truly welcome, something extraordinary happened. She found another table, a place where someone noticed her tears, a place where someone moved a chair and said something very simple. There's room for you here. And sometimes, that is all it takes to change the entire direction of a life. The truth is, family is not defined only by blood. Family is defined by behavior, by the people who show up, by the people who listen, by the people who make sure there is always a place for you at the table. Years later, Emma would look back at that lonely Thanksgiving and realize something surprising. It wasn't the worst day of her life. It was the day her real life quietly began, because if one door had not closed, she might never have walked into the room where another family was ready to open theirs. And perhaps that is the real lesson here. Sometimes the moments that hurt the most are not endings. They are redirections. They guide us away from the places where we are merely tolerated and toward the people who truly see our worth. If this story resonated with you in any way, take a moment to like this video. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience and the unexpected ways life can change, consider subscribing to the channel as well. You never know, the next story you hear here might be the one someone else needs the most. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone in your own family? Did it bring conflict? Or did it bring peace? Sometimes the stories we share with each other become the encouragement someone else has been waiting for. And if Emma's journey reminds us of anything, it's this. You deserve to be chosen, not as an afterthought, not as a last option, but as someone who matters, exactly as you are.